Okay, I want to build on a couple of our previous workshops, I want to see if I can get you guys to Rhino model some of your own forms, starting first with some low resolution polygons and simulating up into shell structures. I'm just going to walk you through an example, and what I was hoping is that you could experiment with this process and come up with your own forms. I'll explain a little bit more about that in class. I'm going to start with a polygon. Okay. So I'm going to type in Polygon command, and then I'm going to click the number of sides up at the top and type in 3 to make a triangle. And then I'm just going to hold shift and draw out a polygon of some size, something like that. And I'm then just going to mirror this around itself a few times, like this. So I'm just running the mirror command, and I'm creating kind of a tiling, I guess, of triangles, as you can see. And you can maybe mimic my form that I'm working on here on your own. I end up with something like this. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I think it's 9 triangles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah. So 9 triangles. And this will be kind of the plan framework, if you will, of what we'll build next. The next step, I'm just going to draw some construction lines, and I'm going to go to a different layer for this. Go to layer 1, I guess the red layer. I'm going to draw a center point using my O-snap at the bottom into each one of these triangles, because it's good to know as a reference, even though we may only use one of them. But just just in case, we'll throw that in there like that. Okay. And then I'm gonna head over into my layer 5, the white layer, and just draw some. I'm gonna turn that center thing off and just draw from every corner point across to its opposite side, like this. Okay, making sure that that's perpendicular. You have to snap to the perpendicular. That has to be perfect. Okay, and I'm gonna grab I'm gonna go back to layer 1 and just draw a circle of a arbitrary dimension, something like that. Yeah, and then I'll draw another one at these points, at the midpoints that we found before, to a smaller size, maybe something like this. And then copy that one around to all the midpoints, like that. So I end up with this. And what we're doing is finding intersection points here at those points there. And I'll head back into my default layer and draw some black lines again. So what I'm going to do is well, yeah, I guess for the sake of demonstration, I'll draw these as lines. But you can see I'm going to snap to this intersection using the intersect O-snap down at the base there of the screen, and just draw my lines from those intersections around, like that. And this is just, you don't necessarily have to do this for the next step, but I wanted to show you what we're drawing as kind of as a set of outlines. And this is going to form the kind of start of, let's say, a low poly unit, a low polygon count unit that will turn into mesh faces, and then we'll simulate. And we're going to kind of propagate that form through this kind of framework down at the base. So without having to, I'm not going to copy and paste all my construction lines. I'm just going to use the meshes for that. So I'll just go to layer 5. Technically we should be labeling these layers, but I'm moving kind of quickly through this. So I'm just going to keep going and then put it in a different layer. And I'll go up to mesh up at the top, polygon mesh primitives, and 3D face. And then the rule of this assignment is to never have a 3D face with more than 4 sides. So you should only be clicking 4 times. 4 corners, 4 sides. That's the rule. So let's walk through this. So I'm going to snap to those corners like this and just draw that face. And in order to see it, we should turn on our view. So we've just drawn a mesh face, and that's not going to have iso curves. It's going to just be a plane like that. And then we can mirror that around we can then take these two, and I think we can mirror these. So let's see if we can mirror these along that face there. And then we can mirror them across their other face like that. And we end up with our kind of a Y shape setup here. And I'm just going to grab all those that I just drew the meshes only, the mesh faces only, and I'm just going to mirror them around like this. And then keep going. So keep going until you complete the entire pattern all the way through, using those triangles as the kind of mesh, the mirroring axes, as you can see that I'm doing here. Like this. Okay. So our mesh setup is more or less complete. This is our kind of base topology that we'll use to simulate upward to make this kind of interesting kind of archway structure. Okay, so the next thing is to open up Grasshopper. And let me just, there we go. All right. All right, so we got Grasshopper open. First thing I'm going to do then is just kind of bring in some stuff. I'm going to bring in the meshes, and I'm going to do that quickly. I'm just going to grab a mesh component or mesh parameter up at the top there like that. And while I'm in Rhino, I'm just going to type in SEL mesh, so select mesh. That's going to select all of our meshes on our screen. And then we can go over to Grasshopper, right click on that, and set those at multiple meshes, because we're putting more than one in there. And then it's a good idea probably to go through and maybe turn off that layer that we drew the meshes on, like that. Yeah, so that, or you can hide them so that we can't see the overlap. You know, overlapping previews, as you know, can be a little bit frustrating. Okay, so what we're going to do then is go over to Kangaroo 2. I got a lot of little tabs up here. There we go. And we're going to go to Mesh and Combine and Clean. So we're going to clean this mesh up, weld it all together to form one, and then turn off the former preview. All right, and you know the drill here. So constantly turn off those former previews to avoid overlap on screen. Staying in Kangaroo, we're going to head over into Mesh again and refine that mesh. So we're going to grab the Refine component, turning off the former preview, and I'm going to refine this to a level of 2. So I'm just going to throw in a panel there just to refine that a bit further, so that's nice and dense. And that's going to, you can see what it's now following the way we drew. It's building out a series of four-sided faces into the four-sided faces that we already drew, so that it's higher resolution and it's constructed in the way that we wanted it to be. We don't want any triangles for this exercise. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do is head back into Kangaroo and head over into Mesh. And I know that later on down the line I'm going to probably need to change these directions, so I'm going to go ahead and just get into the habit of it now. And this is going to be important later when we think about fabrication. So we're just going to go ahead and do that now to kind of reorient all of our mesh faces in the way that we want, or in a more consistent pattern. Because we modeled it in Rhino, it's likely that those are inconsistent, even though they look good on screen. One of the things we need to do too is kind of, before we start simulating stuff, we need to find these points along here and along there, and we're going to set those as anchors so that this thing doesn't fly away when we add force. And the method I like to use for this, I can walk you through a Grasshopper method, and I think we did that in one of the other tutorials, but sometimes when I'm working quickly, I like to just head over into Kangaroo, go to Mesh, find those naked vertices, using that component, the naked vertices component. You could turn off the preview for that component because it gets a little muddy, and then grab a point parameter up at the top and just kind of plug that in from the naked points, and that's going to just show you all the ones that are on the edges. And because we've got a lot of these edges over here, I don't want all that stuff. I can't just plug that into my anchors. I only want these. So what I'm going to do, for the sake of time here, is just to bake these onto a layer that's on. So let's just say the layer 3. Okay, and then I'm going to turn off that preview. And you can see that my layers are now turned on. And then I'm just going to bring them back in. You know, I'm just going to go into my top view, and I'm just going to start selecting these, you know, the ones that I want. So I'm going to right click on this, set multiple points, and I'm just going to start grabbing all the way around before I hit enter all the points that I'd like to anchor so that they stay affixed to the ground plane like this. Okay. And one more set like that. Okay. So your screen should probably be doing something like this as well. And then we hit spacebar or enter, and our points are now set. Okay. Very nice. And we can now add these to our anchor set. So we can go to kangaroo, goals point, anchor, turn those into anchors. And the last thing we need then in order to complete our sim is to you know, put some basically some springs through this mesh set of lines here. So I'm going to go to goals, mesh, and then edge lengths. And this is the kind of, you know, the quicker way of doing it than having to extract all the lines individually. And then our factor, you know, we can just drop a couple sliders in here. Our length factor is going to be between 0 and 1. And our strength is something that we can set maybe with a panel. Well, no, maybe not a panel. Let's use a slider, except you know, we'll go between 0 and 10. So go ahead and like double click on the gray area here and just type in like 5.55. That'll give us a slider between 0 and 10 like that with some decimal values. And then we can set a strength that we can increase or decrease as necessary. So I'm just going to leave it at around here, 2.5 and 4.3 or whatever, just to kind of get this thing rolling. And I'm sure we'll have to adjust that later. Okay. Let's go into Kangaroo, grab our solver. I'm going to use the regular solver for this one. And just to kind of set that up, we'll grab a button and our Boolean toggle. I'm sure you're getting probably the hang of this by now. Okay, go back to Kangaroo. We need to give this thing some force. So we can go to goals point, grab the load, and from here we're going to plug in the clothed points. Okay, so from this old component that we used, we're going to take the clothed points and just pop them into the P parameter there. I'm going to then also, I'm just going to move this. I'm going to grab a Z, so I'm just going to type in Z there, do a search, and then I'm also going to drop a slider onto this between 0 and 1, a default slider, like that. I'm going to turn that down pretty low because I want the force to remain pretty low in the beginning at least. One more thing is to go back into Kangaroo and grab that light bulb. So we're going to main, show, and we want to show this mesh on the other end. And I'm going to use that first. I'm going to throw that in there. And then I'm going to turn off my preview for my original mesh here so that I don't have an overlap. And now, you know, coming out of the solver, we'll end up with, we'll see the mesh as a result. You can go ahead and start adding your forces. So we can add the anchors. We can add the force. Well, yeah, and the edges. And let's see what we got. Okay, so if we run that, you can see that we've now started to form a pretty nice looking and interesting kind of set of intersecting, branching arches with some spatial quality. You know, not much coverage, but some spatial quality. And we can play with these sliders in order to get, you know, different height, different stretch, different effect on this. And of course, that's all relative to the force that we're applying from below. The other thing that I like to do is, you know, in terms of the output, this thing is going to show us our vertices and our mesh coming out here. In this case, it's looking pretty good. It's just it's actually outputting as a tree in this case. That's not always going to be the case. So for this, it's, while you guys are making your own work, I would suggest just leaving it like that to get something to work, and then we can have a look at the nature of the data coming out. But in this case, what I can do is I can simply flatten that by right-clicking, hitting flatten. I can turn this off to remove all the vertices from being shown. And then the first thing in line there is my mesh. But it's a good habit to go over to set, tree, and then clean the tree. And that'll kind of knock out all of that, all those null values that come out from the anchors. And this is also giving us all of our lines and and the mesh work, but it's at least turning off all the points that were also shown here, in 3D, which was a bit distracting. Okay, cool. Yeah, and so this is the more or less the name of the exercise here. This is more or less the process. I thought it would be interesting for you guys to try different configurations. Now, the triangle as a base is one idea, but you can imagine others. But what we're trying to do potentially for this, larger scale model that I'd like to maybe try to build with you guys is to kind of build it from paper strips. And we're going to get a lot of mileage out of forms like this because there's not much surface area. So they're more branching-like arches instead of more dome-like surfaces. And that's going to make, I think, the cutting and the assembly process potentially a lot simpler and faster. Okay, which is one of the reasons why I decided to show you this example. But that doesn't mean you should limit yourself to only these kinds of forms. You're more than welcome to experiment with different kinds of dome-like structures, different kinds of shell-like structures, whatever you think that you're interested in trying out. There are other ways of modeling these things. Of course, you can form circles. You could imagine changing the proportions of these triangles. These are all equilateral. They don't all have to be the same. You could actually modify the triangle itself. And this won't affect anything, but it would have if we started, see? So if we modify the triangle, then our edge would have been over here, making this area much smaller, or this part of the mesh much smaller. Doing that around, you can imagine how that might start affecting, the form in general. You can also start closing it out. There could be a loop here, and anything on the inside would be not anchored, anything on the outside would. You may also imagine anchoring somewhere in the middle and then having a series of arches that come not only from the edges, but actually come down somewhere in the middle and then back up again. That is a little trickier in this example, but I can show you some ways to do that if that's where your interest is. So I think what I'd like to see you guys doing is just experimenting and trying to use the method of modeling here to produce something, I guess, in a similar way, but I guess with your own authorship. And so what that means is you would have to repeat the process. So you'd model stuff in Rhino first, and then you'd start bringing it in. So you've got your meshes that you would bring in, and you would replace this. What I suggest you guys do is keep this as a sample. You could internalize that information, and then you can bring in your own meshes using your own component. That's also going to have to be true for your anchors. You're welcome to manually draw the anchors. The only problem is when you subdivide the mesh, you won't necessarily have that to snap to, so this is why we do this. So this process will have to be, more than likely will have to be replicated. So you'll grab your mesh, you'll find the naked points, you'll bake these into Rhino, and then you'll reselect only the ones you want and put them into the anchor input. Okay, so as you're changing your forms, you're going to need to kind of update the data that you're bringing into those two components, both the anchor and the mesh. Okay. Maybe for the sake of example, I'll walk you through that process. So I'm just going to copy and paste something from a different file that I've got open here, and you can see that it's pretty similar in terms of the language. The geometry that I used here. It's more or less this thing, this Y shape. And then, but instead of connecting them around to form circles, what I did is I intersected them in the middle. I had to redraw that kind of miter connection there. And that's why they're outlined in white. These were the ones that were original. These are the ones that are kind of coming into one another. And then I needed to form a new end condition to bring that all together. And what that does is it forms these nice closed loops. Let's walk through how you would use the same script here and modify it ever so slightly in order to get this thing to simulate as well. So what I'm going to do is just copy and paste this whole block here just for this example. And I'm going to go ahead and right click, clear these values out like that. All right, and kind of start over. I'm then going to select those meshes only and pop these in to there. And I'm going to make sure that this thing is turned off, the solver is off, and I'm going to work incrementally. So I'm just going to I'm going to turn on that preview so that I can see the mesh that I just brought in. And it's looking pretty good. But for this exercise, just to show you another kind of alternative, again, and this we could simulate, and I think it'd be fine and probably produce some pretty cool stuff. But I also want to remind you of Weaverbird and how you might be able to use this as well. In this case, because we have closed loops, it might be a good idea to soften these loops. So what I'll do actually is turn on this one instead, and then I'll head over into here and grab the Weaverbird Catmull Clark, which you might remember from an earlier exercise. And then I'm going to hide those meshes so that I'm being a little bit more clear. I can clearly see the result. I'll right click over S here and then kind of fix those corners. This is up to you. You don't necessarily have to do that. You could leave them smooth. I'm going to fix them because it's, I think, a little more clear for this example. And I'm going to just put in a level of 2 on this one. And you can see now that that's kind of taken it's taken the edge off of those holes. I still have a kind of point of convergence here that we could fix to kind of look a little bit more like this, but for the time being I think this is sufficient. Okay, so that's a new mesh that we now put in. I can now replace that. This was, I don't need that one anymore, so I can replace it with this new one. And then the process would be to bake these out, our naked points. So let's just bake these out again on layer 3. And you can see them emerge there. And then the step would be to go ahead and select the ones you want and put them into the anchors. So let's set those. And I'm just going to select just the ones at the edges like that, like we did before. Same logic. And it doesn't matter what order these are in. It's actually fine to do it like that. All right, so there's the edges. And now you can see that it's gotten darker. That's because I have an overlap preview, because now we're getting data out from here. I'm going to go to my perspective view, see what this is starting to look like as I sim. Looks like, yeah, there we go. So but this is not the end result that I was looking for, and I'll show you what I'd actually like to do here. So I'm going to turn that down, head back into my top view, okay? And you can see that I got this thing hanging out here. I'm going to add some anchors to this so that it comes down to the ground down over here as well in the center to form these little like tube-like shapes in this area. So I'm going to right-click on that parameter set there and set multiple points. And here I'm going to just pay attention to the pattern, and I'm going to select. You can kind of see from center out it hits this point and then back again. I'm going to start with that. So I'm going to select those 3 points, the center, and then the next 3 points. I'm going to do that for each one. 3 points, center, 3. 3, center, 3, and then again. Pretty simple. And then I'm just going to hold shift and add those to my anchors. Head on off into perspective view and run the simulation again. And now you can see that I've formed not a dome, but a series of kind of branching archways again, but in a very different configuration, using almost the same set of geometries as we did here with some slight modification. Okay. And of course then, going back into these forces will allow you to experiment with different kinds of, I guess just different heights of this, and different results. Okay, so this is 2 examples, or it's actually 1 example of this just being kind of brought through and modified into a different configuration, different set of anchors, and using the same exact script, really, aside from just adding this Weaverbird component to pull it off. Okay, so hopefully you guys can experiment with this process. We're hoping to see some interesting results. I know that there may be some questions in terms of how to start, or what to do in the beginning. I would say you can just kind of build off of what we've done here, or try to start something of your own. If you're stuck, let us know. Try to have some fun with it. If there's any issues, you know where to find us. Okay, we'll talk again next time.